I've got one question that I ask all of my guests who come on Thinking Class. And that question is, what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life that you once thought was perhaps set in stone and absolute? You certainly wouldn't change your mind on that. And then you did. And what was it that made you change your mind?
I'm actually going to tie it to the previous question.
Hmm.
And I'm going to tie it to my admiration for Wesley, Wilberforce, and the Earl of Shaftesbury. I mean, in my personal religious life, I really tend towards the very high church Anglo-Catholic, contemplative background of Christianity. So, I mean, I must have thrown in another hero as Dame Julian of Norwich. This was a great, elevated 14th century spiritual writer. And when I was at school, the only really vigorous part of Christianity that was there, apart from reading George Herbert privately to oneself, it was the evangelical side of the school. You had the Christian Forum, and what do I do to be saved? I am saved. Hooray, I'm saved. All of that background. Now, because I fancy myself as a deep intellectual and I see the depths of Christianity and all the mystical and spiritual writers, and all of this evangelical stuff is just imposture and incredible, and it's got to be much more complicated than that. I had no respect for the idea of the evangelical tradition. And I got some terrible arguments with some of the teachers who were doing the Christian Forum side of things. And all linked up ultimately to Holy Trinity Brompton and so on, and the Alpha movement, the Alpha course. And I think actually over the course of this book, even though my churchmanship hasn't changed, I think one of the sort of differences I have is I have a far greater respect for that different tradition within Christianity, and I think a far greater openness for those different spiritual responses, that sort of personal, immediate, ecstatic sense of personal salvation, which is, as I say, is not the way I've approached it or I belong to it, but I now completely respect that tradition within English Christian life, and I respect the inheritors of that tradition. And I repent of my earlier terrible contempt. So I think it might not sound particularly significant, but I think for me there was actually quite a difference and a leap. And I think it might set me apart from some of my school friends who I'm still in touch with, who probably adhere to that sense of disdain for the other tradition. But I now have that greater reverence for the tradition, even if it's not my own.
Well, they were remarkable people. Similar to you, Bijan, I was drawn in by the contemplative angle, whether it was the early church fathers, Saint Augustine, all these people who wrote, which when you read their own accounts of their faith and their grappling with God and judgment and all of those things, that you could feel that too. You could relate to it, and you could spend time meditating on it and trying to turn things over in your mind about how that might lead to new action and metanoia, going beyond the mind that you already have, all those kind of things. And yet what the evangelicals got right, or get right, is the action bit. They just get to action. And you mentioned Wesley, and as you brought him up, it took me back to a book that I'd read not too long ago. It was by an Indian chap, and I can't remember his first name, but his surname was Malal Gandhi, and he wrote a book called The Book That Changed the World. And it was the impact of the Bible, and specifically the King James Bible, and all of the things that led to. And the passage on John Wesley and the Wesley brothers in general was remarkable. I mean, they would ride around the country on horses, setting up churches and civil society groups and charitable organizations to make sure that people were treated with the dignity that that Christ gives them, I suppose. That and indeed, as you say, Wilberforce was an abolitionist, and the reason, one of the driving forces why we abolished slavery, and that was born of the evangelical movement as well. And yes, I had a very similar response, the crude, dismissive response in some way, and thought, oh, this isn't anywhere near complex enough. But actually, you can stew in complexity and theology and contemplation a lot of the time, but then it can actually stop you from living the Christian life in some way. And I liked what you said earlier on in the conversation, where you said some people in public life, I mean, many people in public life were so driven by their duty to God and thereby others, that there was no time for debate and conversation. It was just get to it. We know that it is wrong for these people to suffer this way, or for us to be even considering doing that thing. And I think we can probably agree that public life is somewhat diminished now when you look at where people derive their authority from. It's from distant courts. It's from similarly bureaucratic organizations that speak in a consulty kind of language, and there doesn't seem to be a deep moral and spiritual life there anymore. And I think for that reason, it's something that we've absolutely lost. And I think your book captures the things that we've lost. And I'm glad you wrote it, because it's testament to what the country has been, and it probably still is under the surface. And actually, because it's now there in print, and you've brought it down from the Tom Holland Western civilization to England, I hope enough people pick it up, Bijan, that it drives people to want to not just save the tradition, but to try and live it. So as a personal message, I'd like to thank you for writing the book, because I think it's a very important contribution to the national life and the understanding of the nation.